All right. So in the last class, we did talk about GDP, aggregate supply, and aggregate demand. I told you aggregate supply is the total output produced in a country by all the individuals, firms, or produce other producers. So it is similar to GDP. We can say that as well. All right. So now we'll be into uh, in discussion in more detail. Let's see. Let me use the paint. Okay, so we have talked about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, and you are already familiar with demand and supply. Okay, the chapter you covered in grade 9. Okay, I know it was way back, but still you have some idea about it. So let me just remind you that the chapter you covered in grade 9 about demand and supply, that was something like that. There was a demand curve. Okay, let me just draw it. There was a demand curve, and demand curve is always negatively sloped. And why demand curve is negatively sloped always? Because demand curve is drawn with the help of two variables. One variable we take on y-axis, that is price, and the other variable we take it on uh, uh, x-axis, quantity. And you did that in the earlier class or classes, right? So this is y-axis and this is x-axis. Okay, and this negatively slope demand curve shows that there is a negative relation between price and demand. You can see that when, let's say, if this is the price, let's say this is the price. So what is the quantity or quantity demanded? You can say uh, the products people demand this much. So when price goes down, you can see that what happens to quantity or quantity demanded. You can say it is increasing. You can say that. Okay. So this is like price going down and quantity or demand, quantity demanded is going up or increasing, right? This is the scenario. And that is why demand curve is negatively sloped. So you are already familiar with that. Similarly, if I talk about the other way around, that is, let's say price increases. Okay. So if price increases this way, right? So it means that earlier, let's say the price was 2 and then it increases to 4. If this is the case, so earlier at 2, what is the demand or the quantity? Let's say that is 20. And when price goes up to 4, so now the quantity demanded is 10. So you know that. So there is actually a decrease in quantity or quantity demanded, right? So this is how a demand curve is drawn. Similarly, that is a simple demand curve, right? Um, then you must have studied supply curve as well, and supply curve is like this. It is upward sloping, and why it is upward sloping? Because it is drawn with the help of again two variables. And what are those two variables? Again, one variable is price. Okay, this is price, and the other variable is quantity supplied. I am just using the word quantity. Okay, so it means if there is a supply curve there, it means quantity supplied, right? So you can see if I make some changes in the price, let's say this is the price. For example, this is uh, the price. So let's say this is the supply or the quantity supply, the producers who are willing to produce and sell. Now, if price increases, let's say if this is the case, if price increases, what happens to supply? You can see that supply is also increasing. So it is quite obvious. price is increasing, supply also increases. So this is that is why supply curve is always positively sloped, because there is a positive relation between supply and price. Okay. Similarly, if I say that price is, rather than going up, it is going down, for example, if price is going down, so the opposite is true, price going down. Okay, let's say the price was earlier 20, then it reaches to, let's say, 10. So at 20, what is the supply? Let's say it is 100. So when price goes down to 10, so now the quantity, let's say it becomes, or it goes to 50. So you can easily observe here as well, when price goes down, supply decreases, right? And this is the supply curve, right? And why this is the case, you know quite clearly that whenever price increases, let me just show it to you. Whenever price increases, producers see more profit in producing it. Simple as that. Whenever there is let me just show it to you. Let's say price is, let's say, 10, okay? And let's assume that the cost is, for example, of producing that product is 5. So you know how to get profit. Again, the formula is the same. That is price minus cost, or revenue minus cost, whatever it is. So we'll take 10 minus 5. It will be 5. So profit is 5, right? Now, if price increases, okay, so rather than 10, now let's say price becomes 20, okay, and obviously price has changed, not the cost. So cost remain the same, that is 5. So what will happen now? Instead of getting 5 rupees or $5 profit, because now the price is 20, you will be getting, or the producer will be getting 15 rather than 5 only. So that is why whenever price increases, producers are willing to produce and sell more. That's why they increase the supply in order to get more profit. Simple as that. And whenever price falls, producers see less profit in producing that item. That's why they are not willing to produce more. So does supply actually decreases. It does not increase, because producers are discouraged. Okay, so this is actually the case. Similarly, if I talk about demand as well, now let me just remove that, because this is not actually the topic under discussion. But I just revised quickly the previous concepts you studied in grade 9, and that was related to microeconomics. Similarly, if I talk about demand, so you know that when price increases, demand decreases, right? It tends to fall. And the reason is because when price increases, people find it expensive, and that's why they do not buy it. And simply when price falls, people find it more affordable. They are able to buy because now it is cheap for them. So they increase the demand. That is why there is a negative relation between price and demand. Now, the topic is okay, but we are going to discuss, that is uh, aggregate demand and supply, shown with a diagram. Let me just show it to you now. Now it will be clear to you, because I just revised quickly the earlier concepts on which it is based actually, right? So aggregate demand, you already know, we discussed it. So I'll draw it. Okay, the demand will be the same, aggregate demand, a negatively sloped demand. Okay, because the relation will be the same. Okay, either it is simple demand curve or aggregate demand curve. Because simple demand curve means, which I just discussed earlier, that is the demand of one product. Okay, here aggregate demand means demand for all the products. So it can be consumption expenditure, you know that we discussed it. It can be consumption expenditure, it can be investment expenditure, it can be government expenditure, it can be export expenditure, and then we subtract imports from it as well. You know that, and we discussed it. This is how aggregate demand is drawn. I mean, these components we call them components of aggregate demand. So obviously you won't be asked to find these components because this is the question which actually come in A levels, not in O levels. But you need to have an idea that what is the equation of the aggregate demand and how demand curve is drawn. Now this is the demand curve, and what do we take on y-axis? Again, because now we are studying macroeconomics, it's not micro. So here we won't write price. I will write general price level. So when I say general price level, what does it mean? It means prices of majority of the goods and services in a country. Simple as that. So it's not the price of one product. Remember, it's not the price of one product. That's why I'm using the term general price level. Okay? Because we are not talking about the demand of one product. Simple as that. Okay, and what do we take on y-axis? It won't be quantity, remember, because what we studied earlier, that was the quantity of one product. But because we are studying macroeconomics, so we will be talking about the total output produced in the country. Simple as that. So for that we use the word GDP. You know that. Okay. GDP is the total output produced in a country. Okay. So rather than taking quantity, we will take GDP because it represents the total output produced in a country by individuals or firms which are present there. Right. So now if we draw aggregate supply curve, it will be like this. Okay, so it will be a positively sloped uh, supply curve. So you know what is the reason for aggregate demand curve? The reason is the same. And what is the reason? Reason is that price and output has negative relation. Okay, because demand comes from demand can come from consumers, it can come from investors, it can come from government, right? So when price level increases, I'm using the word price level. I won't say price because if I say price, it means price of one product. But here we are not talking about price of one product. Okay, so I'll say price level. When price level increases, obviously consumers tend to buy less, investors tend to invest less, government tend to spend less or to start different projects. So overall, when general price level increases, aggregate demand also aggregate demand decreases, right? Now, if I talk about aggregate supply, the same is the reason. Aggregate supply comes from producers, okay, firms which are responsible to produce. So when general price level increases, producers are encouraged to produce more. As I told you, because of the same reason. When general price level increases, producers feel now there is more profit in it, in producing items. So they tend to produce more. So, and that is why aggregate supply has a positive slope. Okay, this is actually the case. I hope that you understand the same relationship or the same logic holds true here as well, as we discussed in the other diagram of demand and supply. But here, rather than taking demand and supply, we'll talk about aggregate demand and supply. Okay, now you can see equilibrium is there again, right? This is equilibrium. Okay, I'll say equilibrium. You studied that as well in the uh, in grade 9 or earlier classes. Okay, but that was market equilibrium. Let me just draw it quickly so that you will at least get an idea. Let's say this is aggregate, this is demand and supply, the
Sir,
previous one.
can you please start recording the lecture?
Yes, I am recording it. All right, now this is supply, this is demand, this is what you actually studied in grade 9, right? This is equilibrium. Okay, equilibrium basically means in the balance when demand and supply are equal, right? This is demand of one product, this is demand by single consumer, this is supply of one product. Okay, this is micro. So this is equilibrium, right? But this is what we call it market equilibrium, right? What market equilibrium, right? But when we talk about aggregate demand and supply, we this is equilibrium, but we don't call it market equilibrium. Okay, we call it economy, the whole economy in equilibrium. Remember, that is the difference between them because we have to talk about the whole economy because we are studying macroeconomics here. Economy in equilibrium, okay? An economy in equilibrium is always or it always occurs when what happens when aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. Simple as that, right? So now let me this. So if I drag it right there, this is the equilibrium price level, okay, and this is uh, the equilibrium GDP. At the equilibrium point, what is the GDP? Now, why do we call it equilibrium? It's not only because aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. Yes, this is true, but another reason for which we call it equilibrium, that is that general price level. Let me just write it there. Price level or general price level. General price level has no tendency to change. Now, price level neither increase nor it will decrease, right? So that is why we call that point or that state equilibrium, where general price level will not change at all. It won't increase or decrease. We will discuss why it happens and when general price level starts increasing and when general price level starts going down. We'll talk about it, but you need to understand this first that equilibrium is a point where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply and where general price level has no tendency to change. It means price level remains the same there at this point. And we call it economy is in equilibrium, right? Okay, now we'll talk about now let's see the let me talk about the other points in the slide as well. Okay, just have a look. um, Point number 3, rising aggregate demand and falling aggregate supply lead to inflation. Let's discuss that first. Okay, first of all I'll talk about rising aggregate demand. Okay, just see how it happens. Now aggregate demand always rises when it shifts to the right side. Remember, whenever aggregate demand shifts to the right side, we call it aggregate demand is increasing. Now, let me explain you another concept quickly because I am not very sure whether you know the demand supply chapter very well or not. This one, okay? So let me just tell you about it. For example, if I just a minute. Okay, for example, if I'm talking about um, aggregate demand, right? So you know what is the relation. Relation is when, and we take price here. We take price here. Okay, just a minute. Someone is there to join. Let me see who is. Haris Bullard. I know. I do not recognize that. Okay, all right. I'm admitting him. Okay, now this is aggregate demand. So you can see that. Remember, this is price is this is price and this is GDP, or let's say this is aggregate demand. Okay, so when price actually falls, aggregate demand increases. You can see that. Okay, here aggregate demand price is falling, aggregate demand is increasing, right? This is also called that there is an increase in demand, but we don't call it rise in demand. Do you know why? Because this is happening because of price factor. Okay, all right, I will talk about it because there is a difference between This increase in demand, and let me uh, draw another diagram. Let's say this is also aggregate demand, right? And we take price here, let's say. So let's say this is the price again, and this is the aggregate demand. Now, if I take another demand curve, draw another demand curve here. Let's say I label it as aggregate demand 1. Now you can see the problem is, now you can see price is the same, but aggregate demand is increasing. You can see that aggregate demand is increasing, but there's no change in price. This is what we call, let me write it, this is what we call rise in demand. See, rise in demand, because this is not happening because of price. Remember, rise in demand does not happen because of a change in price. Price remains the same. Okay, and when I talk about this change in demand, this is what we call extension in demand. Extension in demand, and this always happens. In both cases, demand is increasing. Remember, here demand is also increasing in this case, but here demand is not increasing because of change in price. Here demand is also increasing, but demand is actually increasing because of a change in price. You can see that price is actually falling and aggregate demand is increasing. In the above diagram, price is the same, you can see that, but demand is still changing. It means there are other factors other than price which are changing the aggregate demand. So here, in our diagram as well, we'll talk about, let me see, we'll talk about rise in demand. Remember, okay, I don't want to go into that detail, because when we'll revise the chapter demand and supply, I will be discussing this difference in detail. But right now, just to give you an idea that there is a difference between extension in demand and rise in demand. Rise in demand happens because of change in factors other than price, and we also call it, let me write this, shift in demand. And shift in demand always occurs when you see more than two demand curves, more than one demand curve. You can see in the diagram as well, AD and AD1, right? And extension in demand always occurs when there is a change in price, right? So we are going to talk about actually shift in demand or rise in demand. Remember, okay? Now, okay, so and let me tell you why shift occurs, why shift in demand occurs. It occurs because of change in any component of aggregate demand. Either consumption increases, investment increases, aggregate demand increases, or export increases, or even imports, there will be a change. Let me give you a small example. Let's say aggregate demand is, for example, it is, let's say 400, for example, and consumption is 100, investment is 200, whereas um, to give you a better idea, right? And let's say exports is 200 and import is 100. Now, if you work it out, you will find the answer will be 400. 100 plus
सर
200,
सर
300.
आपकी स्क्रीन नहीं शो हो रही.
Okay, all right, let me see. ये अभी हुआ है, पहले आ रही थी ना?
सर पिछले 5 मिनट से नहीं आ रही.
All right, so you must have told me about it. Okay, all right. Now you can see. Okay, I'll just explain you again. To your left side, in the above diagram at on the top, you can see aggregate demand is increasing. Whenever you see a demand curve shifting towards right side, we say there is an increase in demand or rise in demand. A better word is rise in demand. And it happens whenever there is a change in consumption, investment, government expenditure, export, or imports. And you can see that I just gave you an example. If consumption is 100, investment is 200, that is 300. And when we add exports in it, that is 500. And then we have to subtract 100 from it, and we get 400, right? Now, if there is a change, let's say now let's say consumption is 100 100. Investment is, let's say, let's say 250, 250, and export remain the same, that is 200, and same is the case with imports as well. So what will happen? What will you get? The aggregate demand will be now, that is 250 rather. I wrote 259, 250. So you will get how much? You will get 450. Okay, why? Because there is a slight change in investment. So rather than 200, now the investment is 250. Let's say there's a change in one of the component of aggregate demand. So you can see that rather than now demand is 400, it is now 450. So in the diagram, we'll show it with a shift in the diagram, okay? Because it is happening because of the change in any of these components. Remember, consumption, investment, government, export or import. So whenever these component changes or any one of the component changes or all of the components change, we always show it with a diagram by drawing another by drawing another aggregate demand curve toward right side, because demand is increasing. So increase in demand is always shown with a rightward shift in demand curve. Remember, so I'll take here AD1. This is a new demand curve. So I was just giving you an example earlier as well, when the screen was not shared, and that was, this diagram is about that demand can increase in that way as well. But this is happening because of change in price. Price is going down and aggregate demand is increasing. This is not increase in demand, and you won't find more than one demand curve there. Although this is not the topic under discussion right now, but still I decided to tell you the difference. We will discuss the difference in detail when we'll be revising the chapter demand and supply. Right now we are talking about this one. Okay, when demand increasing because of a change in the components of aggregate demand. Remember, so aggregate demand will shift to the right side when it increases. Okay, and when aggregate demand, let's say, falls, there will be a shift in the demand curve towards left side. So remember, when aggregate demand increases or shifts to the right side, it means there is an there is a there is a rise in demand, and whenever aggregate demand shifts to the left side, we say there is a fall in the demand curve. Although they would not ask you to draw the diagram of aggregate demand and supply, because it actually happens in A levels. They demand students to draw it here, but they may give you the aggregate demand and supply diagram. So you have to identify there as well. So that's why I'm drawing it. They won't ask you to draw aggregate demand and supply diagram. Okay, now the equilibrium changes. Okay, because now the new aggregate demand curve is 81 rather than 80. Okay, so now the new equilibrium will be how much? Let's see. Now the new equilibrium will be this one. Okay, because here, now if I write, the new demand curve is AD1, so that is equal to aggregate supply. So this will be our new equilibrium, and we'll call it E1. Okay, E1. So now if I uh, drag it towards y-axis like this, so we can easily see that the price level has gone up. Okay, price level has gone up because of rise in demand. And what has happened if we drag it, just a minute, if we drag it towards x-axis as well, where we have taken GDP, so you will see that GDP has also increased. Okay, GDP has also increased. So I will use the use GDP 1 here. Okay, so this happened actually, but the thing which you need to understand, that is that general price level has increased. Okay, so earlier it was, let's say, P. Now it is P1, right? So remember, whenever general price level increases, I am writing it here. Whenever general price level increases, inflation takes place. Although we are yet to study the topic inflation, but that was important to tell you there something about inflation. That whenever general price level increases, what does it mean? It means prices of all the goods and services, or prices of majority of the goods and services which are produced in a country, they are increasing. Okay, so we call it inflation. Remember. Okay, now if you see the slide back, now you can understand. See, rising AD, rise in demand, lead to inflation. Right now, just forget about falling AS because we have not discussed it. Forget about falling AS, just think about rising AD. So I explained you how rising aggregate demand will lead to inflation with the help of the diagram as well. So it becomes easier for the students to understand, although they won't demand you to draw an aggregate demand and supply diagram. All right, because now I'll talk about aggregate supply as well. But any question up till now, just let me know. I'll explain you. Any question
So
from
you
your
told us
side?
that an increase in the general price level would result in the increment in demand and the price and the GDP. So, but you made a diagram over the top left corner in which the price is constant, yet the price is changed. The
Sorry, where?
GDP
Come
have
again.
the GDP have extended, yet the price is the same.
Okay, just a minute. Just wait a minute. All right. Okay. Yes. So, what are you saying?
Sir, you've drawn a diagram on the top left corner in which the price is constant, yet the GDP have extended.
Okay, just a minute. Let me share the screen. Yeah. Now, which one? Which diagram you are talking about?
So the top left corner.
Top left corner. You mean this one? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes. So here, actually, this diagram is about only aggregate demand. This is not about GDP. GDP is taken when we actually draw both aggregate demand and supply diagram. Okay, so here we are just showing aggregate demand is increasing. There is no GDP at all there. Got it?
So what can be the possible reasoning?
There, because okay, reason is because here, listen, when we talk about GDP, the total output produced in a country, we always consider the demand and supply. Why? Because, for example, think about that producers, they keep on producing more and there is no demand. Do you really think that they will keep on producing without considering the aggregate demand? There is no point, because if they keep on producing and there is no demand for those products, what is the point of producing it then? So unless and until we actually draw demand, aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram, we cannot actually come to know what is the actual GDP level. But when we talk about aggregate supply, it means aggregate supply actually shows the willingness of the producers to produce. It's not about that they actually produce it. It's the willingness of the producers to produce more. But obviously, they only produce when they see that there is equivalent aggregate demand there as well. Otherwise, there is no point producing it. So when they actually produce it, because they know that aggregate demand is there, we say that yes, GDP is also increasing. That is the logic behind it. Otherwise, if we only consider aggregate demand, that only shows this is the willingness of the people to buy, right? But if there is no output, how can GDP increase, right? It means aggregate supply needs to be considered as well. So when price, when in the diagram above which you pointed out, we only took price and aggregate demand. So aggregate demand is there, right, on the x-axis, because right now we did not consider the GDP. We cannot, simple as that, because we have not talked about aggregate supply there. And aggregate supply means the total output or the willingness of the producers to produce. Yes. Is it clear or still you are confused about it?
Sir, but isn't it obvious that when the aggregate demand have increased, then the businesses will obviously increase the prices? For example, in the COVID days, the demand for the mask increased as well as the price increased as well.
Yeah, listen. So what happened there actually when demand increased? Okay, when COVID-19 started, demand increased. So were you finding it easier to buy masks? Tell me, was it easier?
No, sir.
No, so it means that GDP did not increase in the same way. Despite increase in demand, there was no change in GDP. That's why masks were not available. But then gradually, because prices go up and producers realize that now there is more profit in producing and selling masks, then they started producing it. And then actually GDP also increased because the now more businesses they went into producing masks. That is my logic, now. Still confused?
No, sir, it's clear now.
Okay, now listen clearly. Listen. Okay, whenever I talk about, let me just draw the diagram so that you will be clear about it. If I, let's say, draw a diagram of aggregate demand, this is aggregate demand. This only shows the willingness of the people to buy. It does not show that demand is also increasing. Like people are already buying. If this shows that people are willing to buy, remember, but they can only buy if enough products are there in the market. Simple as that. So this is not the item people are buying. This is the willingness and the ability of the people to buy. Okay. Similarly, if I talk about aggregate supply in the same way, this is aggregate supply. So this does not show that uh, what is the actual GDP. Okay, it shows that willingness and ability of the producers to produce. Now they are willing to produce more, but it does not mean that they are actually producing more unless and until they consider the aggregate demand in the country. So that is the logic behind it when we study aggregate demand and supply alone. Okay, although this is not the topic under discussion. So whenever we discuss demand and supply together, we always take GDP on the um, x-axis to see that what is happening. I hope that you got it now.
Yes, sir, it's very much clear.
All right. Any other question? Because one of the student is I don't know the name of the student is saying that समझ नहीं आ रहा because we cannot even unmute. I don't know why he is not able to
सर मैंने
unmute.
आपको मैसेज किया था वो 10-15 मिनट पहले किया था, तब वो पता नहीं स्क्रीन भी शेयर नहीं हो रही थी, अनम्यूट भी नहीं कर पा रहे थे.
All right, all right, all right. Okay, fine. So any other who is still confused, I can explain. Otherwise, I'll move forward. So what, okay, what was the purpose of drawing these diagrams? The purpose was to tell you the logic behind this statement. What? Falling AD lead, sorry, rising AD lead to inflation. So I just explained you that concept with the help of diagrams. Okay, that's it. Now I'll talk about even falling AS can lead to inflation as well. Let's discuss that now. Let me rub this first, or let me just remove all of it. Huh? Just a minute. All right, I will draw it right there. Okay, or let me just draw it there on the same diagram. Okay, I will there. Okay, now aggregate supply, if it shifts to the right side, left side, remember, there. Now, just see, it means that supply is decreasing. Aggregate supply shifts to the left side, and it means producers tend to produce less. And this can happen because of any reason. Like, for example, producers now do not have the required amount of resources to produce. For example, now because if, think about, if I talk about wheat crop, okay, and other crops as well. So let's say if now land is now not fertile anymore, okay, so it means that now the farmers cannot use that land to produce. It means that aggregate supply is bound to go down. So whenever aggregate supply decreases, this way we call it shift in aggregate supply or decrease in aggregate supply. And whenever supply curve shifts to the left side, we call it decrease in supply. And now the new equilibrium will be this one. Okay, aggregate demand is the same, but aggregate supply has shifted towards left side. So we will now call it E1. Okay, and what will happen now if I drag it towards y-axis? You will see the price level as well. Now, let's say earlier if the price was P, now the price is P1, right? So it means price has increased, right? And what has happened to GDP? GDP has gone down. That is quite obvious. Why? Because when producers are not producing, so obviously it means that GDP has to go down. So this is now the new GDP, G, sorry, GDP 1. Let me just GDP 1, right? So it means GDP has gone down as well. Now remember, I just drawn this diagram. You need to understand that when I talk about aggregate supply alone, okay, here, let's say if I talk about aggregate supply alone. So if I say price increases, aggregate supply also increases, right? This is not shift in supply. Although supply is increasing, right? We take aggregate supply here in this case. In this case, there is no GDP. Why? Why I'm not taking GDP? Reason is because this supply curve only shows willingness of the producers, that they are willing to produce more if price level increases. It does not mean that they are actually producing more. Remember, right? They are willing. That's why we are not showing GDP, and there will be no effect on GDP. Okay, this is increase in demand, right? This is, or we can call it extension in demand. This is extension, sorry, not demand, supply. Okay, and this happens because of price factor. You can see that when price is increasing, supply is also increasing. Okay, but this is not the topic we are discussing. Okay, but as I explained in demand diagram as well, I am explaining you here as well. So what is the topic under discussion? That is shift in supply. Okay, and this is how shift takes place. Now let's say this is aggregate supply. So, and this is the price. This is the aggregate supply there. Now if aggregate supply shifts towards left side, okay, shift is taking place, and this can be because of any reason. Like I gave you an example. Now the producers lack technology. Producers do not have sufficient amount of resources in terms of land, labor, capital. Okay, whatever is the reason, but it is not the factor price which is changing supply. Simple as that. It is, or these are the factors which are other than price. Now you can see. the producers are tend to produce less. It's not the actual production. It means they are willing to produce less. Okay, and but you can see that there is no change in price. Price is not changing. Still, aggregate supply is decreasing, and this is happening because of factors other than price. Okay, and this is the topic under discussion which we are discussing. So whenever we see, okay, supply can shift to the right side as well, na? Supply can shift there as well. Okay, this is also possible. Okay, and this happens when now more resources have been discovered and now producers can produce more and they are producing more. So then GDP will also increase. You can see that, but this is not the topic. Huh? We are discussing that why inflation occurs. So if aggregate supply will shift towards left side because of any non-price factor other than price. Okay, so what happens to price level? It increases, and I told you that whenever there is an increase in general price level, sorry, the general price level, it shows that inflation is taking place. So now, if you see this point, so you can understand it well, this one, that rising aggregate demand or falling aggregate supply, in both cases, there will be inflation. General price level tends to increase. So why I explained you that, because the purpose is you need to understand that what is the importance of aggregate demand and supply. Government needs to control aggregate demand and supply. Why? Because if they keep on changing, let's say in a negative way, and inflation keeps on rising, it will have an effect on people. And you know that they always, the government always looks for public welfare. So they do not want inflation to happen. That's why we discuss that and the importance of aggregate demand and supply. All right. So, any question regarding any diagram I drew? Yes. Anyone? If you have a question, let me know. No question from anyone? All right. So, I'm recording it as well. All right. So now, so it is. What's the time? Let me just.
सर एक बच्चा रो रहा है, वो कह रहा है कि उसका माइक नहीं चल रहा, तो आप उसका माइक अनम्यूट कर दें।